I should have covered that. I don't know. I asked you because you.
I don't study. I don't actually study.
So Angie has some time cards just to give you a sense of where you are in your response. That way it can. Yeah, and if you can't see, I think it's green is 90.
Oh,
Yellow is 30, and red is 10.
okay. I do the same thing for my public speaking.
No. I've got presentations coming up. I think I'll start doing that.
I actually give it to like other students in the room, so I don't have to remember, so I can. It distracts me when I'm reading. But I have like another student like keep time and do it, and it moves to like whoever keeping time on. It keeps them more engaged, and I just have.
That's right.
So, but I always forget because I'm like writing notes and I don't know.
We've got a presentation starting tomorrow afternoon,
Yeah.
actually, so that's good.
I've got presentations in all of my classes this week. I don't know how my time is out the way I did this.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this first session of the American Democracy Project's Civic Leadership Academy. I'm Elizabeth Bennion. I'm a professor of political science at IU South Bend, where I also serve as founding director of the American Democracy Project. Some of you might also recognize me as the host of Politically Speaking on WNIT, our local PBS affiliate. And in all of these roles, whether teaching in the classroom, moderating political debates, hosting a televised interview, or participating in a public forum like this one, my goal is always to promote informed and effective civic engagement. The American Democracy Project is delighted to co-sponsor this series with the St. Joseph County Public Library. As educators and information professionals, we share a commitment to an informed and engaged community. We also share a commitment to civil civic dialogue grounded in the respectful sharing of opinions and ideas. The goal of the American Democracy Project is to develop the knowledge, skills, and dispositions required to actively engage in politics and to help people make a meaningful difference in their communities. This Civic Leadership Academy stems from a variety of requests I received from concerned members of our community who wanted to know how to sort through competing claims, to distinguish between fact and fiction, to avoid unwittingly spreading unsupported assertions and fake news. And simultaneously, I began receiving requests from community members for advocacy training. People wanted to know how they could move beyond posting concerns to social media or complaining to close friends. They wanted to know how to influence the political debate, how to contact elected officials, how to track legislation at the local, state, and national levels, and how to engage in safe and effective protests when they felt that elected officials were ignoring them. They also asked about how to mobilize the community to address shared concerns and solve local problems directly without waiting for elected officials to take the lead. Meanwhile, these community members' concerns reflected my own growing concern about the narrative of a post-fact world in which everybody feels entitled to their own facts rather than merely to their own opinions. While teaching an elections course last fall, I was dismayed to learn that in the final 3 months of the US presidential campaign, the top 20 performing fake election news stories on Facebook generated more shares, likes, reactions, and comments than the top 20 stories from major news outlets. It's difficult for voters to make wise decisions when they're relying on fabricated stories. If one votes against Hillary Clinton because of her stated policy positions or her political record, that's one thing. It's quite a different thing to refuse to support her because you believe she sold weapons to ISIS or ran a child pornography ring out of a pizza restaurant. Similarly, there are any number of reasons why one might have supported or opposed Donald Trump, but these reasons should not have included supporting him because you believe a fake story that he was endorsed by Pope Francis, or that you opposed him because you believe that Ireland was accepting thousands of fleeing American refugees leaving just in case Trump became the president. As a political scientist, I believe it is critical that our public policy debates be grounded in facts. Agreement on basic documented empirical facts is a starting place as we consider whether or not policies are working. We can and we should discuss and debate the values that should guide public policy making. We should welcome competing viewpoints and ideas, but people are not entitled to simply invent their own facts or ignore empirical evidence that does not support their predetermined preferred policy positions. It is critical that we know the difference between facts and opinions, between unsubstantiated claims and actual evidence-based arguments. And so I'm delighted to introduce you to tonight's panelists who will be able to shed some light on all of these topics. I'm joined by 3 colleagues from IU South Bend. Dr. Kathy Borshak is a professor in the Department of Psychology. Dr. Louise Collins is a professor in the Philosophy Department, and Dr. Andrea Maluch is a professor in Communication Studies. We are also joined this evening by Professor John Duffy, who directs the writing program and teaches in the English department at the University of Notre Dame. And before we begin our conversation with the panelists, I just wanted to encourage everybody to complete the event survey before you leave this evening. If you need a pencil or pen, you can raise your hand and one of the students will bring one to you. Let us know who you are and why you decided to attend this evening. Check the box to join our mailing list and find out about future events. And let us know which other Civic Leadership Academy events you plan to attend. You can check a box as well if you plan to seek the Civic Leadership Certificate that we are offering to people who attend at least 4 of our 6 Civic Leadership Academy sessions. All of the events are listed in a handout that you should have received, and that handout also includes a summary of the topics planned for each of the events. We want to thank you for coming tonight. We'll start with about an hour of information from the panelists, leaving roughly 30 minutes for Q&A at the end of this evening's session. So let's get straight to it. I want to start by asking John Duffy to briefly tell us how he would describe the difference between facts and opinions.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? I'm really delighted to be here, and I feel very privileged to have the chance to talk with you. When I was asked to talk about the difference between facts and opinions, I thought, okay, that's easy. We all know the difference between facts and opinions. And then I started to do prepare for this presentation, and I thought it's not quite as simple as I thought it was. And I got into all kinds of trouble trying to work it out for myself. So I'm going to put some things out there for you, and then I hope you'll help me sort it out in the Q&A, okay? So let me start with 4 statements, 4 propositions. So the first, the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. 2, pushing an innocent person in front of a train is wrong. 3, 2 + 5 = 7. And 4, in the movie Lord of the Rings, Frodo ultimately destroys the Ring of Power. So those are the 4 statements I'll start with. Now, let's consider 4 related statements. The Eiffel Tower is an architectural monstrosity, ugly and dull. pushing an innocent person in front of an oncoming train can be justified in some circumstances. Math is boring. And in the movie Lord of the Rings, Frodo should have tried to reason with Sauron rather than destroying him. Okay, so the first are obviously facts. The second are more likely opinions. Okay, so what's the difference between the two? I have a very short amount of time and a card that's going to flash any minute now, so I'm going to be quick. Some of the differences. Facts can be proven right or wrong for the most part. Facts are based on testable evidence. We can prove a fact by testing the evidence. Facts are, for the most part, and everything I say you can qualify and find an exception to, but facts are for the most part objective. Facts do not rely upon opinions, and facts are for the most part correct or incorrect. Now, opinions, in contrast, generally cannot be proven right or wrong. They are a perception. Opinions are based on interpretations of facts. They're based on the interpretations of evidence. They're often based on our feelings. Therefore, they're subjective. Opinions can be based on facts, but again, not vice versa. And opinions are not necessarily wrong. Our opinions might be right, but they're not provable. If they were, they would be facts, not opinions. How are they similar? What are the similarities? Well, both are statements. Facts are statements and opinions are statements. Both can change over time. At one point, the proposition that the earth is flat was a fact. Now it isn't, okay? Opinions obviously change over time. They have certain differences in terms of language. They have certain tells. The verbs to be, to have, are typical of facts. Words like is, are, was, were, have, and had. Those are typically factual kinds of verbs. Opinions are more likely to have adjectives of degree, good, better, best, or adjectives of evaluation, such as excellent, or terrible, or fair, or unfair, or just and unjust, and so forth. And opinions are likely to, you're likely to hear qualifying adverbs along with them. Likely, apparently, mostly, and so forth. So those are some of the rough differences. Now, I'm going to read you a couple of statements, and I'd be interested to know, you can raise your hand if you want, if these are facts or opinions. First, mayonnaise makes me sick. Fact or opinion? Fact? Raise your hand if you think it's a fact. Okay. Opinion? Okay, why is it a fact? Anybody? Yeah, I generally go with fact, right? If I eat mayonnaise and I throw up all over you, we have a factual statement there. It made me sick. Okay, how about this one? Donald Trump is a great president. Sorry. Satire? No. Okay, we're not up here to do partisan stuff. This is all about facts and opinions. Okay, so clearly an opinion because we don't have the kind of evidence. And even if we did, people still argue about George Washington or Lincoln. And of course, the facts tend to favor one opinion over another, but you know, we'd have to go with opinion. Okay, how about this one? This one I deliberately tried for something that was a little bit harder. Global warming is caused by human activity. Fact or opinion? Why do you think it's a fact?
Because it's been scientifically proven. It's testable.
It's testable, it's proven. Does anybody want to make the other argument that it's not? Okay, so then when you get a statement where facts are in dispute, how do you determine, and this is really our problem as a society, isn't it? When both sides put a factual spin on two different pieces of information that are seemingly incompatible. Both sides claim that they are on factual ground. So that puts the burden on us to sort out how we distinguish between these two propositions. So some of the things that we can do is, one, now global warming, let's take that as an example. We can look at the preponderance of evidence. Okay, if 95 scientists say that proposition A is true or likely to be true, and only 3 argue the opposite, we look at the preponderance of evidence, okay? We also can look at the quality of evidence. If the 95 scientists work in reputable institutions and work in reputable think tanks and so forth, we can probably give them some credence. If they are working, if they have their own, let's say, businesses as consultants, we'd have to be a little bit more careful about assessing the quality of their evidence. If our political leaders make factual propositions or make statements that they want us to accept as facts, we need to look at the particular interests that they are representing. If they're paid, so for example, years ago you had people, both scientists and politicians, arguing that tobacco was not a cause of cancer. And they presented this as fact, and they presented evidence. But they were also, it turned out, many of them in the employ of the tobacco industries. So we look at the preponderance of evidence, we look at the quality of evidence, we look at the nature or the interests of the people that are presenting the evidence. So these are some of the ways that we can begin to sort out the differences between things we're told when both claim to be facts. Okay? How are we doing for time?
Thank you. We'll go next to Louise Collins, and I'd like to ask you a related point, which is the difference between claims and arguments.
Okay. Well, very briefly, all of us make claims all the time. That was one. We make claims, we make assertions, we make statements. We can do different things with statements. We can compile lists of ideas. We can describe things. This is a room full of people. There are green columns. I'm making a series of claims, which may indeed be factual, which may indeed be true. But there are some different things we can do with lists of claims. One of the really important things we can do with lists of claims is try to construct arguments. When I'm talking with my students about arguments, they're often confused between 2 ideas. One idea is that an argument is necessarily a conflict. What comes to their mind sometimes when I say, we're going to talk about argument today, is they think, oh my goodness, there are going to be 2 sides in the room and people are going to be throwing, pens and spitballs at each other, right? This is not what we do in philosophy classes when we talk about arguments. Rather, what we do is we talk about an argument as a set of statements that have been organized in a particular way. The person who constructs the argument intends for some of the statements made to serve as background reasons, justifications, reasons to believe a further claim, the main point they're trying to get across. The background reasons that we list are what we call premises. The main point that we're trying to establish is the conclusion. Okay? So that's how I would define an argument. And you can see it's not to do necessarily with shouting at people. Okay. Couple of quick things to think about here. All good arguments have 2 features. Okay? Good arguments, the premises are all true, point 1. Point 2, in a good argument, when you take the premises together, when you take the backup reasons together, they provide good support for the conclusion. And later we'll be talking about fallacies, which explore different ways the background reasons given in your argument can fail to provide good support for the conclusion, the main point you're trying to get across. Okay? So I'm going to stop right there. That's what I have to say about arguments as a sort of starting point. It's all about reasoning. It's not about, is the conclusion what you already believe? It's how do you try to justify, offer shareable reasons for the point you're asserting.
When we think about backing up claims with evidence, one of the things that can be helpful is to gain an understanding of what we mean when we talk about the scientific method. So Kathy Borshak, could you talk to us a little bit about this process and why it's important?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm the psychologist on the panel, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about science and also about how we think and how the way that we think can often get us into trouble. First of all, the scientific method, we all learned it, right? 6th grade, am I right? Make an observation of the world. Can we chant it? I mean, make an observation of the world. Form a hypothesis. Yes, right? Okay. And then what do? Once we have our hypothesis? Yes, test the hypothesis. Very good. We've all done this at some point. I know you're thinking back to your science fair winning days, probably, right? We all won the science fair. So we test our hypothesis by doing something important. We gather data. We gather independent data. That data may or may not go our way, correct? We didn't all win the science fair. Our science project sometimes failed. For what reason? Simply because the data did not confirm our hypothesis. What that means is that we put out a testable idea that was in fact falsifiable. And we were ready to accept the data and the conclusions and our findings if it was false. If we were false, we went back to the drawing board. And we continually do this, right? We're all, in a way, what we call in my field, naive scientists. We are all testing our hypotheses all the time. Science is more than just that stage, however, those stages. Science is also about a community of knowers, a shared community. And I think this is an important point also when we talk about science, that we rely for our observations, for our hypotheses, for our measurements, our data gathering, we rely on a community of shared knowledge. And this is important to me because what I believe, what folks in my field believe, factually based on evidence, is that the individual thinker is beyond fallible. The individual thinker, we conclude, is quite an irrational thinker, in fact. In social psychology, which is my beloved field, we don't give a lot of credence to individual thinkers because we are very aware that what we do is we reason, we think, and this is our fancy word, heuristically, meaning with shortcuts. We take mental shortcuts. I'm going to throw a few terms at you. One term that I hope you remember is that we are all, and you can use this in an argument if you want with your spouse, we are all cognitive misers. Sounds good to say. You're a cognitive miser. It's true, but we all are. You are also a cognitive miser. What does this mean? We take shortcuts. We're cheapskates when it comes to expending mental energy. This is going to be my theme tonight, right? We are not good rational thinkers. We come to the wrong conclusions far too easily. There's lots of good reasons for this that I may or may not have time to talk about. But everybody should take a social psychology class someday, I think, before you die. That should be in your bucket list to find out about why are we attracted to the bubble? Why are we attracted to people who agree with us? Why do we seek information only until we're satisfied and then we stop? Because, in fact, we are cognitive misers. We tend to think heuristically using shortcuts. So I can say that, you know, any of the hypotheses I might throw out there for my science project, dogs are smarter than cats, or Canadians are better bowlers than Americans, whatever it is, we can get ask the question in such a way that I get just enough data to satisfy me. So sometimes science doesn't always work when I'm alone. Oh, well, I saw that there was like a test of 4 people and 2 of them were Canadians. Boy, did they bowl well. There we go. I'm satisfied, right? I've confirmed my hypothesis. What I'm doing is seeking out information that I'm hoping to get, right? So it's best to rely on a community of knowers, larger data sets, of course, rather than our 2 Canadian, 2 American bowlers, right? And to question ourselves, am I thinking heuristically? Am I taking shortcuts, or am I going to engage in the long way around my thinking process? And I can talk about that more, since I think I'm out of time.
All right. Yes, we'll get back to that idea of anecdotes and the desire to rely on a single story that somehow grips the audience. But first, I want to have Andrea talk to us a little bit about the fact that not only are we cognitive misers, but quite often it's easy to fall into fallacious reasoning where we engage in logical fallacies or accept the claims based on logical fallacies. And one of the things, Andrea, I think that it's important for folks to recognize is even though we talk about fallacies as mistakes in logic, sometimes the person putting out an argument is not doing it as a mistake. They're doing it very intentionally, aren't they?
Yes, yes. So we all, in our conversations with one another, will fall into these traps where we're not actually being logical in the argument that we're making. But that doesn't mean that just because we do it by accident that it isn't also done on purpose, because these are rhetorical devices, and essentially what that means is they're persuasive devices that typically work. They sound like they make sense. So you'll hear it when you're engaging in arguments, when you're listening to the media. You'll hear a lot of what I'm going to be presenting as examples here. And what I want you to be thinking about today as we're talking about this, and at the end I'm going to give you a little bit of a quiz to see if you can identify some of them, is that you can start to recognize that these are not logical and are actually false. So the first logical fallacy I want to talk about tonight is one that you might have heard of, and it's ad hominem. And that's a Latin term, but essentially the fallacy itself refers to when we attack an opposing person's character instead of their argument, okay? And so when we do this, we're drawing attention away from the argument itself and putting the onus on the other person or our opponent in some way, shape, or form. And I'm going to give you a couple examples here. And the first example is potentially maybe a conversation you've had or experienced. I know it's one I've had. So you go into the doctor and you sit down for your yearly physical, and the doctor says to you, well, Andrea, maybe you should lose a little bit of weight. And you look at the doctor and you think to yourself, well, you're fat, why am I listening to you? And this is a trap that we can fall into, all right? And even if it's unintentional, all right? We may not be thinking, oh, I'm attacking my doctor, and maybe it's hopefully not something we're saying out loud, because that would probably go poorly. But here, we're attacking the doctor's physical characteristics of being overweight, and that actually has nothing to do with the doctor's argument, which we would hope is based on their knowledge and their qualifications to advise us to live a healthy lifestyle, and telling us, hey, you should probably think about losing weight. Another example you might see of this is in politics. So we've all experienced over the last year all of these political debates and campaigns out there. And what we'll see again and again, and we've already heard this example up here tonight, is when a politician attacks another politician's character instead of their qualifications. So this individual cheated on their spouse. So thus, they're not able to be a congresswoman or congressman and work on healthcare reform, when in actuality their ability, their qualifications, and their arguments for healthcare reform have nothing to do with this personal characteristic, and the attack is really going at the person and their personal characteristics again. Another common fallacy we've heard of that you've probably heard thrown around in everyday speech is this term slippery slope. And so this is when we say once a course of action is taken, other events and obviously disastrous events will occur. So I have a couple of examples here, and being a professor, this is one that I've heard in the classroom and I've even kind of fallen into myself. So sometimes when my student comes to me and has a late homework assignment, I'll say something along the lines of, well, if I take it now late, if you can't learn to meet a deadline, you'll lose a job someday because you won't never know how to make a deadline. Well, that's probably not true. I'm hoping that my students have enough in their minds to be able to make deadlines, but it is this slippery slope where I'm equating getting one homework assignment in late to always missing deadlines and then ending in disaster, losing a job, and so on and so forth. Another common one that you've probably heard before is, if we allow gay marriage, the next thing you know, people will be marrying their dogs. So this is the slippery slope example again, where we take one premise and we just go straight into, well, the world's gonna fall apart and end in chaos. Another common fallacy that we'll hear about is, or talk about and use, is straw man. And this is essentially referring to when we distort the position of an opponent and oversimplify their position to make it easier to attack. So an example I have of this is if one politician proposes that they reduce defense spending a little bit, an attacking politician or opposing politician may say that, oh, if we reduce defense spending, it's going to leave the country defenseless. So this is where we oversimplify things, and we're not really getting at the nuance of what is defense spending, how much are we spending, and is a reduction meaning that we're going to be defenseless. Another example might be if we're looking at a company or an organizational standpoint and you get a CEO coming in and saying, hey, let's invest in a new direction for our company. And you might get another executive member, such as a COO, asserting, oh, investing in this new direction is going to ignore our key market. So here again, oversimplifying the issue at hand. Moving on, another very common one you've probably experienced and maybe even had done yourself is hasty generalization. And this is when we draw conclusions based on a really small sample of evidence. So an example of this may be if we said the birth rates in South Bend over the last 2 years have doubled, therefore all across America birth rates are increasing. Well, South Bend's a pretty small sample. We can't really generalize across the entire country to make that argument actually hold water. Another example might be, I've recently bought a car, so this one's on my mind, but if you walk into the car dealership and the car salesman or saleswoman comes up to you and says, our car is the safest on a road based on a test that compares our car to its 3 top competitors. Well, there's probably more than 3 other competitors in that field. So again, it's making a generalization based on too little evidence to actually hold water. And the next fallacy I want to talk about is red herring. And this is when we introduce irrelevant ideas to focus our attention away from the real issue at hand. So we really want to, and a lot of times this is intentionally, distract or move away from what we're talking about and what the issue is. So this is an example I've had from my personal life, asking my husband to take out the trash, and his response is, oh, you're constantly nagging me. So it really has nothing to do with asking to take out the trash. It's really, again, redirecting that conversation to something that's irrelevant at hand from the actual issue of the trash needs to get taken outside. And this could also happen in other conversations. So for example, we already had the example about climate change this evening, but it could be a red herring if one of your friends says, well, weather is always changing, so questions of climate change are irrelevant. Well, that doesn't, again, make sense because the fact that weather is changing really draws the attention away from the issue of climate change. Speaking of drawing the attention away from the issue, sometimes we just evade the issue altogether. And this occurs when we are asked a question and we really just don't respond to it in some way, shape, or form. So an example I have is in an interview, Sarah, Duchess of York, was asked whether she was friends with Prince Charles, and she replied, well, the important thing is I have great respect for the royal family. So again, didn't really give a response. And similarly, you might get, if you ask a professor of science a question about their opinions on evolution or the factual basis of evolution, you might get a response such as, everyone needs to study science. So really we're evading the issue and not actually answering the question. I have 3 more that I want to get to, and then we'll do our little quiz. So another common fallacy that we come across is common practice, and this is when we justify our actions based on the grounds that so many other people are doing the same thing. So an example of this would be, most people are speeding on the toll road. What's the problem if I do it? It's okay, everyone's going 80 out there. And then another one that I've heard across campus is, why can't I smoke marijuana when everyone does it? So the fact that maybe something's a common practice can justify what's going on, when in reality, when we start to
tap or scratch the surface a little bit there, we might be able to see there's some issues. Closely related is traditional wisdom. So the idea that just because we've always done it this way, that means it's the way to do it. So right now there's a lot of conversations in this country about maternity leave policies, and you might hear things such as, oh, we've always done it this way in our organization, so why do we need to change our maternity leave policies? It works. Well, in reality, that might not be a very good argument. Or for some people, if they're going through divorce and they talk about this experience, they may get from a family member, no one in our family's ever gotten a divorce, so that's not okay. And then finally, the last fallacy I want to get to before I test you is this idea of two wrongs make a right. And this is when we justify our actions by looking at or pointing to a similar wrong done by our accuser or our opponent. So it's something along the lines of telling your child, hey, it's okay to hit others if you get hit first. So that's when the opponent does it. That means it's okay for you to attack. Or something that we've seen recently in the media landscape is if you get one news station saying it's okay to report unverified information on air because one of their competing news organizations also reported that unverified information first. It doesn't really get at the fact that the news organization should have verified the information. So this brings me to my little quiz. So you can just shout out the answers when you get a chance, and I'm just going to give you again some examples and tell me if you think it's hasty generalization or ad hominem or what have you. So my first example is, we should not legalize the marijuana prescribed by doctors for medicinal purposes because this will lead to the complete legalization of that dangerous drug. Very good. Excellent. Wow. So impressed. You all should take my classes. Drink Coca-Cola. For 100 years, it's been the favorite drink of Americans. You'll like it. I heard traditional wisdom, I heard hasty generalization. I have common practice for it, so because we're always doing it, but I could see how traditional wisdom would also play here. And it's important to say with some of these logical fallacies that they're not mutually exclusive. So an argument or a position that's asserted can actually have multiple fallacies occurring at the same time. My next example is, a kid comes home and says, hey, what's with all this junk food you bought? You're always railing at me about eating healthy. And the mom says, don't fuss, it was on sale. What do we think this was? Red herring? Okay, maybe red herring. I can't
remember the word, sidetracking the argument.
Yes, evading the issue. Exactly. Very good. And then my last example before we move on is deaths from drug overdoses in Miami have doubled in the last 2 years. Therefore, more Americans are dying from drug abuse. Yes, hasty generalization. Very good. Well, excellent work, everyone. So now when you're in your own lives, you will hopefully be able to identify these a little bit easier. And if you're saying them, maybe be a little bit less likely to do that.
Okay, very good. And now John Duffy is going to share with us a couple more fallacies that we should be on the lookout for. All of these fallacies, of course, are very common in political discourse.
Actually, just one more, and it is from today's Washington Post. President Trump let Republican lawmakers, some of whom are reluctant to support the repeal and replace of the ACA with the new plan, I forget what it's called. And the headline was, Trump threatens lawmakers. And let's imagine the conversation went like this. I have problems with the legislation that's being proposed, says our lawmaker. And Trump's reply was, I'll come after you if you don't support it. What's wrong with the reasoning? There is no. It's a kind of reasoning, and it would be identified in a lot of informal logic textbooks as an example of what's sometimes called the appeal to force, or the Latin is ad baculum, the appeal to the stick, the cudgel. It's when you substitute a threat or coercion or some other kind of ill consequence in place of reasoning. So rather than take on the issue of whether this is a good plan or not, you threaten to punish the person who doesn't agree with you. It's the same kind of thing if you would say to your employer, and I hope that the employer would never say this, but if you were the employer or the employee and you say, I don't think I should have to work weekends, you're not really paying me, or you're not paying me time and a half. And the response is, look, if you can't do it, I'll find someone else who can. That's an appeal to force, okay? An appeal to the cudgel. So that's another one I'll just share with you.
Okay, wonderful. Kathy, we said we'd get back to this idea of anecdotal evidence, and as a social psychologist, I'm sure you can tell us a little bit about why anecdotes can be so powerful and what's wrong with relying on anecdotes.
Sure. Okay, so I want you to just, we call this sort of cognitive priming. I'm gonna get you to summon up some mental images. So you can close your eyes if you want. Think of a drug addict. You got a picture, right? Okay. Think of a person that you know. You don't need a mental image for this. Here's another example. Think of a person you may know who has, at some point in their life, not had health insurance. Do you know somebody like that? Lost health insurance, didn't have health insurance at some point? Needed health insurance, but couldn't afford to go to the doctor? Okay. You know the specifics of, maybe that was you. You know the specifics of that story, right? You know the details of this, and it's pretty easy to think about that person, that individual person, during a grand debate about healthcare and healthcare reform and health insurance. Similarly, with your mental image, your mental prototype of a drug user or a drug addict or a person who's drug reliant, you might have some conjured from the media kind of fear tactic image in your mind, right? Which may or may not actually match the reality of a person who's drug dependent. But those details of the individual are so much easier for us to remember. And this is what we're talking about if we talk about using data from anecdote rather than from large-scale sources. Now, when I teach my students how to do research, and I do this all the time, I say, let's not downplay the individual story. Individual stories are important because they're powerful and because they stick in our minds. If I was going to testify in front of lawmakers about the need for treatment for drug addiction, or if I was going to talk about the need for health care, I may well use the individual details from a person's story. But we can't stop there. That's not our main conclusion. Stories are appealing to us because they are powerful, because we remember them, because they're easy to identify with, right? Because we can get a picture in our head and we can empathize with an individual. We can also always remember the single case so much better than the case of aggregate data. So you remember that person who didn't have health care and what they went through? Can you tell me how many people don't have health care now who are uninsured? Can you tell me under this plan versus that plan, how many people will not have health care? Can you tell me what sort of needs of people who have Medicare are, what remains, of people who have Medicaid? Those things what's the word I'm looking for? Require, thank you. Yeah, that was it, thank you. Written all over your face. Those kinds of ideas require us to remember data, numbers, right? Figures, maybe tables, maybe charts, maybe graphs that aren't going to be as easily recallable to us because we can't put a face on it. So let's always keep in mind that although we might remember the individual case, the individual person, I might know this terrible case of somebody who smoked pot when they were a teenager, right? And then terrible things happened to them in life. And I therefore conclude that people who smoke pot in their young years go down the road of road of death and doom. But that's not aggregate data. That's the one person that I can remember. That's the single case. And we have to be careful because we get led into this hasty generalizations if we argue from the single case. And I'm not saying that people's actual stories aren't important, just that we can't draw conclusions about everybody from that one person. Okay, thanks. I won't knock anything else over, I promise.
Promises, promises. All right. So we talked a lot about making arguments, supporting claims with evidence, fallacies to look out for. I want to think a little bit also about what it means to craft an ethical argument, and we'll start with you, John.
Okay, this is something that my students and I talk about a lot, and this is hard to do, I think. Let's go back to what Professor Collins said earlier about an argument, that it's not a quarrel, it's not an attack upon another person, but it's a series of, it's when you give reasons in support of a proposition that's uncertain, okay? So in my classes, we tend to talk about arguments having at least three components: the claim, the evidence, and what we call in freshman composition language, the counter-argument, okay? So the claim is the statement that you make, that's the proposition. The evidence is what you provide the good reasons to support that. And then the counter-argument is what we ask our students to always think about, which is what are the reasons why that would be given in opposition to what you're arguing? Why might you be wrong? What would be good evidence that you would be wrong? Okay, so let's just hold on to that for a moment as the definition of an argument. Now, what makes an argument ethical? Well, the way that we've been talking about it is most people, when they think of an argument in terms not of the attack and not of the fight and the quarrel, but rather in terms of what I've just described, they think of it as an act of persuasion, which it is, for the most part. Some people talk about arguments as acts of inquiry, so we learn things. Or we talk about arguments as building consensus or achieving reconciliation. And all of that is true, I think. But I want to give you a different way to think about argument. And that is that every time we argue with another person, and when I say we argue, I mean when we make an argument to a friend or a loved one or a family member or to a stranger, when we write a letter to the South Bend Trib, whatever the venue might be, we are, in a sense, initiating a relationship. We're beginning a relationship with another human being, a reader or multiple readers or a listener or someone. In fact, the poet Yeats would say that we argue with ourselves. He calls that poetry. But I'm not going to worry about that yet. We're just talking about when we argue with another, we begin a relationship. Now, the question to ask is what makes that relationship succeed and what will make that relationship fail? And that, I think, is what walks us into the questions of ethics. So Aristotle had a word he used. He called, the word was flourish. So let's think about that. What would make an argument flourish? Now, if we say that arguments have three constituents, let's begin with the claim. The claim is that human activity causes global warming, or that Lake Michigan is cleaner than it used to be, or whatever the argument is. What's going to allow that claim, that relationship to flourish? What qualities of the claim have to be present for it to succeed? I think most of us would say it has to be truthful. There has to be a mutual expectation of honesty between the two of us. There has to be some mutual expectation of respect. I have to be respectful in the way I make the claim to you. I can't lie to you. I can't cook the evidence or cook the claim. I can't slant it. And if we want examples of that, turn on most television talk shows and watch for 15 minutes, and you'll see examples of not doing that, okay? But we also have to, as listeners, we have certain obligations in terms of the claim being successful. We have to evaluate the claim honestly, cogently, rationally. In other words, we can't listen just for the purpose of proving the person wrong. We can't listen just for the purpose of distorting the claim because we know we disagree with these people. So there have to be certain expectations on both sides for that claim to be successful. Now, let's say we satisfy those conditions. an argument is still not an argument absent evidence. We must have evidence. There have to be proofs. Again, Aristotle, Aristotle didn't get everything right, but he got a lot right. And one of the things he said at one point was, arguments are really just two things. They're claims and proofs, period. They're nothing else. Now, that's wrong. But there's something to what he's saying, that arguments don't succeed without, or they're not really arguments without evidence. Now, what is evidence? Evidence is, now we can talk about good evidence, bad evidence, the kinds of evidence, and so forth. But at the fundamental level, I think, evidence is a statement of our accountability. It's our willingness to be answerable for the claims that we make. So if I'm going to talk about global warming, or what we should do in Syria, or whether we should build another 10 roundabouts, here in South Bend, I have to provide evidence for that claim. I have to be answerable. I have to justify that. And again, that shows respect for the people to whom I'm making the argument, and it says something about my willingness to be accountable and to display or evince my own integrity. Again, it works both ways. Evidence has to be regarded. We have to trust. When you make an argument to me, you trust at some level, if we're going to have a successful argument, that I'm going to assess your evidence, your claim and your evidence rationally, cogently. In a sense, when I make an argument to you, we tend to think of arguments as winning, losing, dominating, but in a sense, an argument is an act of humility. When I put my claim and evidence out there, I'm asking you to judge me. I'm asking you ultimately to make the decision about whether my claims should be acceptable or not. So evidence is our way of stating our accountability, and on the part of the audience, it's a way of saying, I'm rational, cogent, and fair-minded enough to evaluate this evidence in a fair and a just manner. Now, how am I doing for time? Am I okay? Time. Okay.
Have a minute of mine.
You sure?
Sure. Go
All right,
for it.
very quickly.
Or 2 minutes.
That would be unfair. The final part of the argument, we talk about is the counter-argument, and that's when we ask, and when I'm teaching argument to my students, I say, okay, you could be wrong, but at least there's evidence out there that's going to tell you you're wrong, so go find it. What does that call for them to do? Well, they could look for things that they know they can knock down, and then we come back to the straw man fallacy, or they could commit themselves to truly inhabiting the perspective of another person, at least for a while, to see how relevant and how good that counter-argument may be. What does that call for? Well, it calls for fair-mindedness. It calls for a certain kind of intellectual generosity. It calls for a certain kind of intellectual courage. If I have really strong views about race, if I have really strong views about gender, and somebody says, you need to read this because you're going to find this is disturbing for you, that calls for me to show some integrity, some courage, some generosity in reading those arguments and taking them seriously, not shutting them down without giving them a chance. So an ethical argument, I think, all these qualities of honesty, answerability, accountability, fair-mindedness, intellectual courage, these are what Aristotle called virtues. And we don't need that word necessarily. It's an old-fashioned word. A lot of people have problems with it. We could call it traits or dispositions or habits. But we have to, to make ethical arguments, we typically demonstrate these virtues. So, and that's really hard to do. So I'll stop.
So I will just add 3 sentences, maybe. You've spoken very fluently and elegantly about the ethics of constructing arguments on any subject matter. I would say that when we're talking about constructing arguments on the subject matter of ethics, so we're not just arguing about roundabouts, we're arguing about abortion, capital punishment, issues that are focal in contemporary moral controversies. all the points you've made about the importance of exercising certain dispositions to treat others with respect, with fairness, with open-mindedness, and to hold on to one's own integrity at the same time, humility, all those dispositions become yet more important when we're talking about these moral controversies, because these things are so central to people's heart, to their sense of their own identity, and so we need to be very respectful, very compassionate, very patient with others and ourselves when we move into that territory. And it's scary, and it's exciting, and it's interesting. And if we go into this together, I mean, picking up on a point Kathy was indicating about the idea that as a community of people seeking knowledge, seeking understanding, we do a lot better than just going off individually. When we start trying to tackle some of these moral controversies together, I think we can make more progress. But it's a risky business. So.
Now, Kathy, sometimes it is difficult for people to hold arguments in which they are bound by these principles of honesty and mutual respect and even rationality, particularly because we are so driven toward accepting claims that we already happen to agree with and dismissing those that we disagree with. So I wonder if you could just talk a minute about why that seems to be the case and why it's so difficult for people.
Yeah. So this is called the confirmation bias, and the definition of this is the fact that, we probably already know what this is, that we tend to seek out information, and then we pay attention to that information, and then we better remember the information that confirms what we already believed in the first place, right? So this is different cognitive activities that we engage in. Seeking out information, we're cognitive seekers. This is how we use our minds, but we seek out what's in our bubble. Anybody who spends any time on a political Facebook message knows what I'm talking about, right? You know who your friends are, and who your people are, and who your community is. And this goes for Twitter and other forms of social media, other forms of broadcast media, certainly as well. Everybody talks to the folks who they already agree with. We can invite people onto, if I had a show, and I wish I had a show, I would invite only people on that already thought exactly the way I do, and because I would seek them out, and that would be a facet of the confirmation bias. I would pay close attention to them because they agree with me, and I would better recall information that I already believe. Now, this is the same, basically the same process that we engage in when it comes to stereotyping and prejudice, by the way. We seek out information that confirms our prejudices. We remember information that confirms our prejudices. And it's the exact same process that we go through. And why? It's because we're cognitive misers. We're thinking heuristically, and we end up staying in our bubbles, unfortunately.
Before we go to audience Q&A, which I want to do quickly because I think that will be one of the most interesting parts of the evening, I wonder if any of you have any advice for how to talk with people who disagree with us or with whom we disagree.
You start. We'll do like 1 minute each, something like that? Okay.
So what I tell my students when they're developing arguments and really getting into a place where they know they're going to have to debate an issue is that they should really first start with respectful communication. And what that means to me is not engaging in anything that is offensive. So, you know, homophobic, racist, sexist, transphobic, any of those types of statements that will could put somebody in a position where they then feel marginalized or oppressed. And that really just sets the basis for respectful communication. And we had this conversation yesterday of just having good manners in conversation, but that's not always the case for people. So we need to keep that in mind when we're coming into, and an area where there are clearly two individuals or more than two individuals with extremely divisive views or oppositional viewpoints.
When you're talking with people who disagree with you, which in my case is almost always, I think all the things that were just mentioned are things we have to keep in mind, and they are harder when you have passionate views. One thing I would throw out there, though, is, again, going back to Aristotle, he kept a place for righteous indignation. To be an ethical arguer doesn't mean that you give up your commitments. Civility, for example, is not the same thing as ethics, and it doesn't mean that you surrender your views because you want to get along with people. Now, Aristotle did say, he said, anybody can get angry, but to get angry in the right way, for the right reasons, at the right time, with the right people, not everybody can do that, and that calls for thinking, and that calls for a certain kind of commitment, not to just be raging at people, but to put your arguments into a context where you're exhibiting the kinds of virtues that we've already talked about, respectfulness and integrity and accountability. So.
I guess I would just say how to talk to someone who disagrees with you. Remember to listen to.
Very nice.
Okay, so I'll go last. Find common ground is what I'm going to say. We have a theory in my field called the common in-group identity model. Sounds great. Okay. So what this means is the world kind of is divided into us and them, right? Doesn't matter what the point is, what the point of view is. There's your people and then there's those people, okay? Think about what do you and those people have in common. This might require some empathy, which is not just intellectual but emotional as well, right? What do you have in common with those people? We have this little adage that the one thing that's going to end divisiveness and bring us all together, all humans on this planet, is to have like this Tom Cruise scenario where the aliens coming to attack us. Forget all the religious differences, the national differences, the racial and sexual-based differences. We're all in it together. That's basically what the common in-group identity model is. It's a little utopian, perhaps, but we do have some common humanity here. And if we seek out and search for and find and discover our common humanity, I think that's one step in the right direction.
Indeed, thinking about what we can learn from people, even Aristotle, who was a world-class misogynist who didn't believe that women were capable of rational thought. So,
I said he wasn't right about everything.
all right, so now let us go to your questions for the panel. If you have a question, go ahead and, great, okay, right there.
I see you have 3 websites there, background, no? PolitiFact, is there such a thing?
Yes, I think that these fact check sites are very helpful. One of the things you will notice is that then people will debate about the fact check sites and whether or not they got it right. And that's a healthy conversation to have because you can look at the debate and you can actually read the arguments and the evidence, and they will provide citations to where they're getting their arguments, and you can check them and confirm. And so, while no site may get every single thing right 100% of the time, Snopes, for example, is nice in terms of seeing if something's just an urban legend that's already been debunked before you share it. And so that at least gives you a starting point, and then you can read through their analysis and decide whether or not you accept it. Also looking when you see a particular story to see, wait, are other sources actually covering this? And what else is on that page? Oh, wait a minute, this political story is right next to the 5-headed alien story. Maybe I want to see if other sites actually confirm this particular story. And so I think that it's really quick and easy to consult a fact-checking site as a starting point before you instantly click share and spread misinformation.
Now, I understand, and I'm used to know. I have not heard of fact check, but I didn't mean that. PolitiFact, I've gotten pretty jaded over the last 30 years because Washington has gotten so bad. Both parties, I'm not specific to any party. It's just gotten so bad and so far from what our founding fathers had envisioned. And I just doubt that there are any PolitiFacts out there.
So I'll let the panel take this. The one thing I would say is sometimes what PolitiFact is checking is things like somebody claiming, I never said that. And they will then go and find the 10 different times a person said it with links to the original articles, videos, etc. So in that case, there is empirical evidence, it's on video, it's documented in a story, that person did indeed say that. Now the person can say, I've changed my mind since then, but that's very different than saying, no, I never said that. And so those kind of things can be tested, or a voting record. PolitiFact and factcheck.org will look at voting records to see. So I think that there absolutely are such things as empirical facts in politics, in addition to the many and varied opinions and beliefs. Any other thoughts on that question? Right, it's not a sort of last-minute, run-of-the-mill, one person in their underwear in their basement site.
I would just add that in the extremely polarized place that we're in right now with hyper-partisanship, there are people doing this work, and I commend them for it, who are trying to remain nonpartisan in their fact-checking and remain neutral, and I give them a big shout-out every chance I get to do that.
And that's another thing you will see with these sites is they will be equal opportunity pants on fire ratings where they'll have Republicans and Democrats and Libertarians, and they'll have, oh, this was in fact accurate, or this was absolutely not accurate. And that's a good sign too. If your site shows one party is always right and the other is always wrong, you probably want to keep on looking. Yeah.
And that may be part of the confusion and areas that we might be able to address some of the warnings of the ones that aren't written.
Right, exactly. So people have started sites, and there are increasingly articles of people who are putting together lists of sort of fake news sites where they will use a different extension and make it look like a fact-checking site when really it is a tool for fake news to spread misinformation. So it's a good idea to, again, look at those sites, look up the reputability of the sites, look at some of these lists of known fake news sites.
And come back next week, right?
And come back next week where we'll actually share those with you.
I was just going to add too, if you come across a link on Facebook or Twitter, and it takes you to a site that you're not familiar with, so maybe it's not the Washington Post or the New York Times or something that you have a good sense that you're not sure where this information is coming from, always check the site for where is the primary source. So who are they citing? Is this information coming from some guy in his underwear's tweet? Because that was an issue with a lot of the fake news stories coming up, is that a news site, and I use the word news loosely, but a media site would pick up a story off of social media, and so people were not paying attention to that, and they weren't following it all the way back to the primary source. So pay close attention to that, and that really comes into this, these fallacies. So really doing the research on your own too.
The site that I have used is VoteSmart, and somebody whose opinion I respect told me that they are to not use them if they're biased. Is there? I thought that they were.
Project VoteSmart. They will do ratings of candidate and politician voting records, and I think they're a fine site. I mean, another good resource here locally is, during election time, is Vote 411, the American Democracy Project and the League of Women Voters partner on that side, and those are directly the candidate's own statements. We ask questions so that can help people think of what's relevant for the different offices, but then it's the candidates who type their responses in directly, and they're just character limited, so you're not getting a filtered viewpoint. Vote Smart similarly does candidate surveys, and then they use the candidate's own words, and that's a good thing to look at. The other would be voting records, and as long as they're accurately reporting how people voted rather than telling you what it means and whether it was right or wrong, it's more of a fact check type of site that you can use. Yes.
I'm curious because I do try to affect social change through some of the activism work that I'm doing in the community, and I often find, particularly if it is one of those ethical areas of conversation or policy or whatever, I'm finding that somebody who might be opposed to me, from a value standpoint or something, they already assume that myself or my organization has a particular viewpoint, and that's who you are, and that's what you're about. And it's like,
May I have your attention, please? The checkout desk closes in 15 minutes. Please have your materials checked out now. Thank you.
to offer, I find that sometimes then I'm getting into an argument with an opponent about like what I really am about and trying to convince them that I'm not what they think I am without even actually getting into then like the areas of shared concern or places where we could find agreement or common ground. So when doing something like pro-choice activism, and you say this is pro-choice and we're open to a range of things, all the response tends to be focused on simply, let's say, abortion, when it's a much larger issue, at least for those of us in this group. So how do you even, what would you suggest, I guess, for having like real constructive conversations when people just aren't open to even, I don't know, giving you that honor of being willing to believe you or extend some of that courtesy or those virtues that you mentioned?
It's a really difficult problem, obviously. We probably wouldn't be having forums like this if it were an easy one. I would say, going back to what Professor Collins said, listening is very important. Maybe not, and I'm not speaking to you personally, but rather than getting our views across, first hearing what their views are and where they're coming from. The problem you've identified, I think, is exactly right. It's when your identity is attributed to the thing, to a cause or to an organization. Sorry. Anyway, the other thing, we talked about argument, and as much as I'm a believer in argument, argument's probably not the most persuasive way of connecting with people. It's probably narrative. It's probably stories, right? And sharing stories is a way that we can kind of see the humanity in one another. Stories are cross-cultural, they're cross-racial, they're cross-gender. There's something about stories that's coded in us. We respond to narratives. So that's another way I think that we can connect with one another. But I think this is a hard problem. Sometimes when I've talked about this, people have, in the Q&A, people will say, well, you're talking about ethical argument. Do you really think that you're going to persuade Rush Limbaugh to change? And I say, no, it's too late for him. We can't help him, right? But we can help one another. And that's, I think, what we're trying to do, is to find those connections.
I'm sure you're familiar with April Ladinsky, who's the Women's and Gender Studies professor at IU South Bend, and one of the things that she talked about in a recent op-ed in the newspaper, co-written with a couple of pro-life or anti-choice, take your pick, depending which side of the issue you're on, activists, is the way that they're trying to forge those personal relationships and share stories about their own children, about their hopes for the community. And that means being willing to go into one another's homes and sit around the table and enjoy some tea and cookies together while actually talking through what areas they can actually agree on, rather than seeing the person who's passionately opposing one another on these issues as the other or even the devil. You, in fact, can find common ground and areas where you agree. And it's can be very difficult, but some of it is, as you said, like getting past that initial label to say, wait, is there something that we agree on? Is there a room for common ground here to pursue goals that we share? But sometimes that very much is through one-on-one storytelling and humanizing those people with whom you disagree so passionately. It's an important question.
And empathy.
Empathy. Yeah, Pam.
I have, we talk about activism, and I don't know if people know that there's going to be a town hall on healthcare, and it's scheduled for Sunday, April 9th, from 3 to 5 at the Century Center to talk about the new Healthcare Act and different components of it. It's free. Our Congresswoman has been invited repeatedly. It will take place whether or not she shows. And I have flyers if you'd like to take some. Pass them out to your friends.
The checkout desk closes in 10 minutes. Please have your materials checked out now. Thank you.
And they are looking for folks that have actual stories about difficulties with insurance or good things about the Affordable Care Act. So it really is looking at all sides of it to complement kind of what you are talking about. So I just wanted to share that information. Thank you so much.
Quickly, I just wanted to say, I think one of the fastest ways to get a point across and open someone up is humor. You know, showing a contrast in humor, you know, and it can flip someone to say, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. So I think humor has a place also.
I'm not very funny. I'll have to work on that one.
Well, you had a cartoon on your line today.
I kind of have a question because you guys get to deal in a world of academia where you have young students coming in. Not to say they're all young, but you have older students. I'm looking around the room today, and we are an older bunch here. Some of us don't necessarily have that experience where we get to speak with young people. I know that other people that I've worked with and trying to reach out to young people, the language gets lost. The language, I mean, just made a lot of the stuff you guys say is true, but it kind of falls on deaf ears because there's such a gap between the age differences and the way we basically communicate. I wonder if you guys could even, I mean, that's a big topic to discuss, but I wonder as far as making your arguments, do you guys see ways that you can bridge that gap between the ages, or to me that's a huge.
Well, so intergenerational communication is something that a lot of times we see talked about in organizational context, because right now we have baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, all in the workplace together, and there is this tendency to be overly nostalgic about our generation as being better. And if you go back to when the baby boomers were the same age now that the millennials are, you know, there was Time articles then that said they were the worst generation, and we've seen it again and again. And I think that it really comes back to being open to these conversations and open to listen. I think that it's easy to fall into the trap of saying young people aren't engaged, young people don't care, young people are just on their phones all the time. And I think that when you say things like that to a young person, and I'm not saying you, but just anyone in general, they don't feel respected, they don't feel like their voices are being heard. So I think it really is for both sides to be mutually respectful toward each other, for someone who's lived longer, that they have experiences that I haven't lived through, but then also for, you know, someone who's older than me and getting into a conversation, them still being interested in what my insights are. And I really just think it is through communication, because you'll start to see we're not that different. And sure, we're going to have different beliefs or values based on when we grew up, but overall, I think at the end of the day, young people are just as socially engaged. They just sometimes don't feel like they're being heard, and I see that in the classroom. And I think that when we as professors ask them to open up and ask them their opinions, sometimes it's the first time for some of them that they've ever experienced that. And I think that those conversations can start at in the home, and really just saying, well, what do you think about it? And I know that's difficult because, you know, it's not always, kids don't always want to have those conversations with their parents, but you know, just asking, I think, can start that. And I mean, for me, that's what really made me want to be socially engaged, was when my family was saying, well, what do you think, Andrea? And inviting me in.
And if I can add, because I teach critical thinking and ethics, moral philosophy at IU South Bend, and we have students that are of a range of different ages, but I think there's reason for optimism. I mean, if you give folks of whatever age an opportunity to think carefully and constructively about issues they care about deeply, and if you kind of model for them that possibility, right?
The checkout desk closes in 5 minutes. All materials must be checked out now. Thank you.
All right. Feeling mortal? I'm feeling mortal. But students, in my experience, are sort of relieved, pleased to realize there are ways you can start to have conversations with folks with whom you disagree about particularly moral controversies, and to realize, you know, if you ask somebody their opinion about this stuff, they don't necessarily throw a rock at you, and if you disagree with them, it doesn't erupt into uncontrollable violence. And so there's this sort of feeling of, I'm optimistic because there's a sense that folks actually would like to have a model. They would like to see, how do you do this? Because it's something they want to do. They want to figure out, how can we talk to folks about abortion? How can we talk to... And so I think there's a hunger out there for models, for opportunities, and if the more we can think about ways to provide opportunities and resources and tools for folks to try to have these conversations, I think there's an appetite out for it. I mean, there's clearly a need, but I also think that people are motivated, including young people, for sure. So I'm an optimist, if mortal.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. In some ways, we have an artificial civil society that gets preserved on campuses, and we can do more with that, I think. I teach a political controversies course. One of the issues that we talk about is gun control, and I will have students who are NRA members who say I oppose any kind of reform and regulation at all, and others who are hardcore gun control advocates. But they read multiple perspectives and authors with different views, and then they have a policy list, and they're put into groups where they specifically will disagree with the people in the group, and they're asked to come up with a policy. And it's amazing that these folks who thought they were so completely 180 degrees diametrically opposed on the issue end up with an interesting policy that they actually are able, unlike Congress, to work through and to find some areas where they actually agree and to talk across difference in productive ways. Similarly, we talk about torture as an interrogation technique and about the death penalty, and often they've hardly really studied at all the arguments on the other side, and so they may be assigned not only to read multiple perspectives, but to represent an author with whom they disagree, and they have to do so accurately, providing the evidence. And it's amazing how much better they understand their own position, but also have a sense that, wow, I now can understand why somebody might not agree with me. And by the way, a lot of my facts were wrong on which I was basing my opinion, so I need to go back to the drawing board. And so I've been very encouraged to see the kind of work that you can do in these classrooms, and I'm hoping that that will happen more K through 12 as well as in colleges with folks practicing deliberative democracy skills and problem solving as well as constructive civic dialogues.
Yes, I have a question. In our society today, we may have a large pool of voters who may not have had the opportunity to understand how rhetorical strategies and rhetorical fallacies impact the ability to have critical analysis of a problem. In your estimation, what would be the opportunities to expand those learning devices to a larger population? So in fact, we don't have those conversations just in an academic setting, but we can broaden the scope of it.
Well, I would say what we're doing tonight is, to me, a great example of this. I think these kinds of forums are invaluable for kicking around these ideas. I mean, a lot of us don't have time to study, to take classes. I mean, it would be great if we could all do that. But so to come together as community members to talk about ways that we can agree and disagree with one another, it's a great start. So I think something like this is a wonderful example of how we can do the kinds of things that you're correctly talking about. We have 1 minute.
May I have your attention, please? The library closes in 5 minutes. Please prepare to leave by the front exit. Thank you.
Please complete your survey on the way out.
Would you accept a quick suggestion in response to her question?
Absolutely.
I think that if anybody's interested in putting what we've learned tonight to use, if you can persuade your friends and family, if they get the opportunity to do jury duty, it is worth it. People, it is transformative. It really is the process of considering only the evidence and reaching factual decisions, considering the credibility of those decisions. It's boot camp for and it's free.
Yeah, that's very true.
Absolutely. All right, well, I would like you to please join me in thanking our panelists. And I encourage you to complete the event survey because you can check the box to learn about all of our upcoming events and make sure you don't miss out. And you can join our email list. You can let us know if you're interested in the certificate. I want to thank you all for coming this evening. We hope to see you back here next week, same time, same place, for a panel on fake news. And I would like to thank our partners at the St. Joseph County Public Library and the volunteers with the IUSB Political Science Club for their help this evening. Thank you all for coming, and good night.
Good night.